Hi, how are you? How you doing? Okay, the primary colors of American historical thought. In the summer of 1856, the pro-slavery apologistic argument for the inferiority of African peoples was most eloquently summarized in an article appearing in the fledgling but prestigious American literary magazine, Putnam's Monthly. The most minute and the most careful researchers have, as yet, failed to discover a history or knowledge, excuse me, to discover a history or any knowledge of ancient times among the Negro races. They have invented no writing, not even the rude picture writings of the lowest tribes. And it's like, first of all, weirdo, have you seen hieroglyphics? Right, weirdo. They have no gods and no heroes, no epic poems and no legend, not even simple traditions. There never existed among them an organized government. There never ruled a hierarchy or an established church. Might alone is right. They have never known the arts. They are ignorant even of agriculture. The cities of Africa are vast accumulations of huts and hovels. Clay walls or horny hedges surrounded them, and pools of blood and rows of skulls adorned their best houses. I feel like they're calling themselves out in this, respectfully. You know what I mean? The few evidences of splendor or civilization are all borrowed from Europe, and that's so false. Because sorry, let me not yell. Because you and I both know that the Greeks and the Romans got a lot of their info from the Africans, from the Egyptians. So for them to be like, oh my God, they have nothing, it's like, you ugly, you ignorant. Anyways, borrowed from Europe, where there is religion or creed, it is that of the foreigners. All knowledge, all customs, all progress has come from abroad. The Negro has no history, he makes no history. Ugly. Yeah, he does. Anyways, this anonymous writer's torturous, comprehensive characterization of history and social integrity of black peoples have appeared in print midway between the two desperate acts of American history. The enactment of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 by Congress panicked into legislating martial law to defend slavery as a property right, and the desperate resoluteness of John Brown's final bloody and racial blow against slavery in 1859. I had to think for a second. You know what? Okay, so wait a second. I need some chapstick. Okay, so you know how the 13th Amendment is abolished slavery. It was like, no more slavery, y'all free unless you was in prison, and then you were property of the state, right? And then police officers were, they started off as slave catchers, right? And then connect that to how the police like watch over like jails. Yeah, that just came to mind. Anyways, it was not, however, some sort of mathematical mean between the political sentiments, economic interest, and moral consciousness that inspired these two mutually contradictory but historically complementary public acts. Each, in its own way, of course, proved to be a necessary condition for the Civil War that followed. The division of opinion among whites and the European immigrant, who perhaps too would be white someday. And this goes into like how whiteness is a construct, like race in as we know it is a social construct. The way that people like, and we can use like South Africa for example, and how they construct race, and they're saying colored, but here in America we don't say that. That's a slur, right? It's really interesting, but I'm gonna keep reading because I already know I'm gonna go off on a tangent. Could not be neatly correlated in arrangements of paired and equivalent moral postures. Black inferiority slash pro slavery, black equality slash anti slavery. But what this statement is saying, it's not this or that. It's not Democrat versus Republican. It's not, you know what I mean? Like, that's not the the anti-slavery, like, ideology was not because they thought that black people were human. That's what that's saying to me. On the contrary, this confident declaration from the bleached bowels of 19th century of mid-19th century American intelligentsia, retching history and historical consciousness from black people was the dominant ideological rationalization of racial oppression in the United States. Let me say that statement again. On the contrary, this confident declaration from the bleached bowels of mid-19th century American intelligentsia, retching history and historical consciousness from black peoples, was the dominant ideological rationalization of racial oppression in the United States. Its arrogant and specious my sister texted me. Does this look like... Okay, sorry. Its arrogant and specious historiography itself, the immediate and mangled product of 300 years of systemic African slavery in the New World, was both an absolute imperative as a cornerstone for the rationalization of a slave society and a logical development of the errant, E-R-R-A-N-T. I don't know if I'm saying that properly. Civilization served so long by racial orders. By the middle of the 19th century, Western civilization, both at the strata of intellectual and scientific thought and that of popular opinion and mythology, had effectively sealed the African past. Okay. The undercut that gave some recognition to the Africans in the black slaves' humanity, and that had been used to nurture much of the earliest anti-slavery sentiment and literature, had been overwhelmed by a more constant and morally profound tradition of racism. What that's saying to me is the people that was like, okay, get rid of slavery, they still thought of black people as inferior because racism is embedded within the Western civilization. Like, they weren't like, this is what they're saying is like, they're not like, oh, black people are equal and that's why they don't need slavery. It's like, they still unequal, they still not human. Because they're, you know what I mean? That's what that's getting at to me. Please let me know if I'm wrong. I could be. The denial of African social order and history was not simply a question of Europe's or colonial America's ignorance of Africa. David Bryan Davis, while reconstructing the descent of the African image in 18th century European thought, has sifted through materials that indicate at the least in this instance, knowledge had not been cumulative. It was known this is in the quotation. It was known 2 centuries ago that Negroes lived in settled agricultural societies, that they cultivated a variety of crops, raised large herds of cattle, and planted groves of shade trees. It was known that they were highly skilled in the use of iron and copper, in the making of jewelry and pottery, and in the weaving of fine cotton textiles. It was known that Africans lived in neat and spacious villages which allowed for privacy to the individual while preserving the intricate system of class and family distinctions. Numerous books told of the Negroes' polite manners, their well-established pattern of trade, their knowledge of the planets and constellations. European travelers and tradesmen, their lives and fortunes often depended upon the practical knowledge of the African peoples, had frequently published such informed accounts detailing social relationships with which they had become familiar. Why such an understanding had not persisted in European thought, Davis is at a loss of explanation. Having come to the proposition that slavery has always been problematic to Western culture, Davis, like Jordan, resorted to mystery. For reasons that can perhaps never be fully explained, it was the African's color of skin that became his defining characteristic and aroused the deepest response in Europeans. Davis, in conforming to racial conventions, has inherited its what kind of bug is that? Sorry. Tautology. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Oh, but what that's saying is that they're like, because they're raised in the West, like their idea, like, no, excuse me, because they're coming from Western thought, they're not able to, excuse me. Western thought is embedded in racism, so that their ideology is gonna be embedded with racism, is what that's telling me. Toot, la 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 la.
Tautology.
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 Tautology. The saying of the same thing twice is different words. Repetition. Repetitiveness. Okay, Davis, in conforming to racial convention, has inherited its tautology. Racial distinctions are on the basis of racial sensibilities. He would have been better served by a less presumptuous inquiry into the ideological traditions resident in Western history. Then he might have realized that after some centuries of racial indulgences, the substratum of Western thought was unprepared for anything else. Like, Western thought is embedded with racism, like starting with the ways in which Irish people were dehumanized. My coffee. And then how that, like, white supremacy expanded, and as white, like, because Irish people were not considered white at first. They were like the first black people, and then it goes on and on and on. That's what that's telling me. Okay, I make some good ass coffee. That's delish. Wait, let me make sure that my notes said that. Okay. That's hot. Sorry. Even the shift in the 18th century and 19th century Western thought from a basis of religious and philosophical epistemology to that of modern science had made little difference. In point of fact, it had merely served to extend the terms and rationales for this fantasy of racial inferiority, for that of the Jewish, Irish, Slavs, and Asians, as well as for blacks. Western scientific thought simply took its place at the latest formal grammar for the expression of racial metaphysics, to which its mostly natural response was acquiescence. That's telling me that race, how they use like religion to justify the dehumanization of others, like they use like the devil, for example, how the devil is depicted as black and evil, and blackness is black and evil, right? And so what that's telling me is that Western thought, and that's what like was foundational to Western thought. Well, not foundational, but was in kissing and canoodling with Western thought is like the religiosity, because it's based off like this Christianity, blah 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 blah, and how that extended to scientific racism, and because, you know what I mean, like that's what that's getting at to me, is that Western thought embedded with racism, and it's all up in this house. I was about to say something else. I don't know what I'm allowed to say and what I'm not allowed to say on YouTube. Okay, let's keep reading. Indeed. Okay, I did not take my ADHD medicine. Indeed, much of this 19th century, one of the most persistent projects for which Western science was employed was the attempt to demonstrate what was already understood to be the natural order of races. Oh my god, you know what's so interesting? Nope, let me shut up. In America, the accommodation of Western historical consciousness to racial ideologies created a particular chain of social misperceptions and historical distortions that endured into the present century. Not only was popular thought affected, but the very foundation of that American academic thought which first began to mature in the 19th century, was suffused with racialist presumptions. The emerging American bourgeoisie, in its mercantile, manufacturing, and plutocratic aspects, was purposefully and progressively achieving its first stages of ideological coherence. This intellectual grounding came to absorb the past of those peopling America as well as their present. The result was the construction of the historical legends that obscured the origins and character of the Republic and the social relations upon which it rested. The hard edges of class division, rooted in the European socio-economic traditions of English gentry and continental European aristocracies and their lower classes, were softened and obscured by a mythical racial unity. Think about that like now. Like, say someone's in like a union. Ow. Sorry, my hand hurts. I don't know what I did to it. Oh my god, you can't see me. Anyways. How was I gonna do that example? The example was just in my head. There's no like working class unity because of racism, among other things, but one of them is being racism. Or lower socioeconomic white people are not able to see, not all, generally speaking. If it don't apply, let it fly. But racism is a fundamental issue because it is embedded in American Western thought. And so there was an example I was trying to get at. Dang. Anyways, whatever. Oh, but one, it created social misperceptions, historical distortions, and it's really interesting. The result was the construction of the historical legends that obscured the origins and character of the Republic and the whole social relationships upon which it rested. I think that's really interesting. Let's move on. The existence of land-rich elites, the social and political prerogatives of mercantile capital and agrarian property, even the genesis of Southern American aristocracy, all this was inundated by girl, ow! Sorry, my hand really hurts. I don't know what I did to it. What's this word? Don Julio. Peon. A thing that expresses enthusiastic praise. Peon. All of this was inundated by peons of the political enlightenment that, culling from Europe the best of its moral traditions, had presumably conducted the people to independence, constructed near-perfect instruments of governance, and provided to the individual rights guaranteed by formal legal codes. Even the long vicarious, I think that's, no, it's not. That is not that word. What's that word?
Vociferous.
Vociferous. Outspoken, vocal. vociferous and sometimes violent opposition of American democracy. In parentheses, this part, the the Democratic Party that had dominated federal policy and federal offices in the second quarter of the 19th century. That's the end of the parentheses. To social democracy or mob rule to its opponents, both symptomatic of the truer character of the social order, and one of its last overt manifestations was faded and forgotten in the wake of the emergent racial consensus. John Brown, closer to the artisanal origins associated with English working class radicalism a quarter of a century earlier, was a suggestion of a suggestion of a certain strata not entirely memorized by the still novel variant of Western hierarchical systems. One could discern the character and direction of historical distortions much earlier, of course. Some of the realities of colonial America were hardly the stuff from which national legend could be easily formed. By the 18th century, American ideologists, already exempted by colonial victory, pacification, and an established slave system from the challenges of the non-Western peoples their narratives would abuse, had begun to construct alternative realities. It would be I don't know what's going on in my brain today. Oh, I did not take my ADHD medicine. That's what's up. It would be some time before their machinations. Ow. That really hurt. That really hurt my hand. I don't know what I did. Machination. Schemes, plotting, plots. Machinations were no longer tolerable fictions. More recently, while reviewing these beginnings, Edmund Morgan, reconstructing the relations of the earliest Virginian colonists with native peoples, summarized the collective psychic state he felt must have accompanied the cycle of atrocities that would extend ultimately into the present century. And then here's the quotation. If you were a colonist, you knew that your I really like this one. And just because of what it's like indicating. If you were a colonist, you knew that your technology was superior to the Indians. You knew that you were civilized and that they were savages. It was evident in your firearms, your clothing, your housing, your government, your religion. The Indians were supposed to be overcome with admiration and to join you in extracting riches from their country. But your superior knowledge had proved insufficient to extract anything. The Indians, keeping to themselves, laughed at your superior methods and lived from the land more abundantly and with less labor than you did. They even furnished you with food that you somehow did not get around to grow enough for yourselves. To be thus condescended by the heathen savages was intolerable. And when your own people started deserting in order to live with them, it was too much. So you killed the Indians, tortured them, burned their villages, burned their cornfields. It proved your superiority. Girl, I was like, that is tea. Sorry. Anyways. Yet, as early as 1751, Benjamin Franklin, a most deliberate ruling class colonial intellectual whose ultimate influence in American society would be vast in ideological, financial, and territorial terms, was already immersed in a quite different record of these relationships. The Europeans found America as fully settled as it well could be by hunters, yet these have brain. The Europeans have The Europeans found America as fully settled as it well could be by hunters. Yet, these having large tracts, they were easily prevailed on the part with proportions of territory to the newcomers, who did not much interfere with the natives in hunting and furnished them with many things that they wanted. The violent event of colonial aggression and its corollary of Indian slavery had already been transmuted in Franklin's nativistic American mind into a relationship of supplication secured by an economic rationale. Indeed, the dependence of newcomers on natives already reversed. The current of supremacist ideology had by now begun its descent into American thought, obscuring from the historically unconscious generations of descendants of colonialists and later immigrants the oppressive violence and exploitation interwoven in the structure of the republic. And that is one of the most important parts from this page to me. Let's make a little mark for the summary that I have to do. The immigrant indentured servant, whose origins were most frequently and casually traced to England, was another of these labor forces upon which the colonial settlements of the 17th century depended. They would fare better than the Native American in the traditions being shaped. Sorry, I said that wrong. They would fare little better than the Native American in the traditions being shaped in American historiography. I know I was saying that wrong a couple times. I was like, why am I saying that wrong? By ruling class ideologies. Of course, it is now generally presumed that the white servant as a class had soon disappeared in the English mainland colonies as a result of the trade in African workers that had begun to reach substantial numbers beginning in the late 17th century. What time are we at? 27 minutes? Girl. It's because I keep talking. This, however, getting distracted. This, however, is not the case. Richard Hofstadter tells us the labor of the colonies, said Benjamin Franklin in 1759, is performed chiefly by indentured servants brought from Great Britain, Ireland, and Germany, because the high price it bears cannot be performed in any other way. As late as the years immediate to the American Revolution, servants still constituted approximately 10% of the 2.5 million people occupying the rebellious colonies. Like the slave, legally chattel to be sold at the discretion of a master, often the subject of cruel punishment and without the rights to property, to marry without permission of the master, or to drink in a public tavern, the white servant joined the vast excluded majority of the young republic's population. Had Lockean dicta been applied to the human beings in British North America on the eve of the Revolution, and had all been permitted to enjoy the natural and legal rights of free men, it would have been necessary to alter the status of more than 80% of the population. 85% of the population. In law, and in fact, no more than 15% of the revolutionary generation was free to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, unhampered by any restraints except those to which they had given their consent. The unfree of revolutionary America may be conveniently considered in 5 categories: Negroes, white servants, women, minors, and propertyless adults, white males. Let's highlight that, because they're talking about an American Revolution. Oh! That just put 2 and 2 together. The privileges of democracy were illusionary for most. White servants themselves were no closer to liberation at the end of the 18th century than were their distracted predecessors, who had joined with the rankling ambitious Indian killer Bacon in a desperate attempt to redraw the boundaries of power and wealth of colonial society in the 17th century. Nevertheless, the tragic experiences of those generations of working class poor were seldom transliterated into historic saga. Even Abbot E. Smith, whose studies would prove to be so important to the reclamation of this class's historical role, found an appropriate instrument was difficult to construct. While he fiddled with the calculation that the actual importance of the servant class to those who organized the settlements might be measured by their proportions of the colonial populations, in parentheses, indentured servants amounted to at least half and perhaps two-thirds of all immigrants to the colonies south of New York. Smith would ultimately insist in bemused of concord with his less than objective primary source was such a measure was finally inflationary. Okay, I'm going to pause here and then keep going. 1 second.